Think about the last time you spiraled over something seemingly small. Perhaps you reread a text a dozen times, or maybe replayed a conversation in your head while driving, or maybe you panicked after sending an email. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody yelled. No one withdrew. And yet your body reacted like you were about to be exposed or shamed or maybe even abandoned. If this feels familiar, then I invite you to listen carefully because this is not random anxiety. This is what we call anticipatory shame. And for women with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety isn't simply just a fear of danger. Rather, it's a relational survival strategy. So your nervous system learned early on that expressing your feelings or your needs, or maybe even your mistakes, could be risky because this meant that you had to expose your authentic self. So in today's episode, we are going to be unpacking what is really driving that anxiety and how it connects to shame and relational trauma and your nervous system. So let's dive in.
Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally.
Welcome back, everybody, to episode 96, where we are going to be talking today about anxiety as a strategy for managing shame. And today I want us to step beyond symptom management because I think in the mental health field, oftentimes we go straight to the symptoms and we try to use tools and coping strategies to manage something that is a lot deeper than maybe just what's on the surface level. And yes, breathing exercises and cognitive tools can be very helpful. But if you do not understand what your anxiety is protecting, then you'll always be treating the symptom and not the root. So some key takeaways that we're going to be exploring together are, number one, how shame lives in your identity. So shame isn't just a fleeting feeling about a specific mistake. Shame can become woven into how you see yourself. And we'll talk about how internalized shame can quietly drive anxiety or self-criticism, avoidance, even when the original source of shame is long gone. The second thing we're going to be looking at is how complex post-traumatic stress disorder creates chronic hypervigilance. So complex trauma often leaves the nervous system stuck in overdrive. Your brain is constantly scanning for danger, anticipating harm, and protecting you, but it can also make everyday life feel extremely exhausting. We'll be exploring how hypervigilance shows up and why your body and mind are doing what they think is necessary to keep you safe. The third takeaway is why your anxiety often serves a relational purpose. Because again, anxiety isn't always random. Sometimes anxiety is signaling concern for connection, for safety, or maybe even belonging in relationships. And understanding this relational function can help you begin to notice patterns and give you new ways to respond instead of just react. And finally, I've added a fourth takeaway for today because I think it's important to look at how shame resilience, which is grounded in research, can shift anxiety at its root. So we're going to be looking at work from experts like Judith Herman. We're going to be exploring how cultivating more awareness, more self-compassion, and more agency can actually work to dismantle shame's hold and in turn, reduce the anxiety that shame often fuels. So let's just dive into part one, where I want us to focus on shame itself and how it intertwines with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So shame is what I would call an identity level threat. So professor at George Mason University and psychologist June Tangney, she's a leading researcher on shame and guilt, and she distinguishes shame as a negative evaluation of the entire self, not just a specific behavior. We might want to look at this as not, I made a mistake, but rather, I am the mistake. The first one, I made a mistake, is more of a guilt response, which allows for self-correction, and it's perhaps a less threatening lens in which we look at our errors. But if we've grown up in environments with high levels of criticism, and maybe there's even fear attached to telling the truth, that could become encoded as, I am the mistake when you make that error. And just to elaborate a little bit on shame work, Brené Brown, she's a researcher in shame and resiliency. And she says that shame is this intensely painful feeling of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. So if you've lived with complex trauma, this really hits differently. Because what it says is that shame is relational, shame is structural, and shame is neurologically embedded. One more expert that I want to bring up is psychiatrist and trauma pioneer Judith Herman. She wrote Trauma and Recovery, and she describes trauma as a experience of profound disempowerment and disconnection. And in her classes that she teaches at Harvard Medical School, she talks about relational betrayal being something that for complex trauma survivors can be repetitive. It can consist of inconsistent care, invalidation, or neglect. And it teaches us early on that being visible or authentic can be unsafe. So how this shows up is internalizing these identity conclusions, such as, I am too much. So if I have a need and I express that need, that means that I am too much. Or perhaps on the flip side of the inadequacy trigger, I am not enough. So if I can't perform to this level, or if I need support, I'm not good enough. I'm not capable enough. And then finally, I must perform to be safe or loved. That's a very classic trauma response with relational trauma with our attachment figures. So the only time I am seen, validated, appreciated, accepted is when I am performing. That has equaled safety and love. And when these beliefs live in the nervous system, our anxiety is not coming up at random. The anxiety is really strategic. So let's move into part 2 and look at anxiety as a form of relational damage control. So just some reframes for your anxiety. It's often asking, what about me will be exposed, and what are the consequences? Early relational trauma teaches us some core concepts. And the first one is that expressing needs could lead to possible rejection. And an example of how this might show up in a complex trauma situation is when a child asks for help or maybe even reaches out for comfort and is ignored or dismissed or maybe even punished. Over time, that child learns that voicing needs is unsafe. And so what do? They begin to suppress those needs. And then later on in the adult years, they feel shame about having those needs. The second thing that early relational trauma can teach us is that showing emotions can result in criticism or invalidation. For example, tears, anger, or excitement might be met with, "Don't be so sensitive," or "You're overreacting." And the message becomes that your feelings are not acceptable. And so you learn to tuck them away. And for many of us that grew up in the 80s and the 90s, if we expressed displeasure or pain or something that was not acceptable, we learned to go and deal with it in our rooms behind closed doors. And that works brilliantly, again, until we are adults and we start realizing that our bodies cannot handle that much isolation to sort out these intense feelings. And so it begins to backfire on us. But yet when we move towards support, that vulnerability might feel very unsafe. And then finally, early relational trauma can teach us that mistakes can equal shame or withdrawal. So examples of really small errors could be spilling a drink and then having an adult with an outsized reaction, forgetting our homework. These things can trigger harsh judgment or maybe even withdrawal from caregivers. So stonewalling can feel super confusing and isolating to the child. And children begin to internalize the belief that these mistakes mean that they are bad rather than mistakes are a part of learning as a human. And so again, what does this result in? This results in a nervous system learning to predict relational threat. So if we look at it through that lens, anxiety became anticipatory protection. And other words for this might be hypervigilance, rehearsing, and scanning. One of the things that I love about Brené Brown's work, to circle back to her, is that she really gave us a lot of language and concrete examples of how shame shows up, how it is universal, and what it needs in order to metastasize and grow. And she says that shame really thrives on secrecy, silence, and a ton of judgment. And so with anxiety, what it's doing is really it's trying to prevent this exposure before it happens. So that's where we see the perfectionistic tendency show up. Like, if I can just stay ahead of this, then I don't have to expose that I'm really feeling shamed. And so this can look like overthinking and checking and replaying all the strategies that at one point in time, again, kept you really safe. So I'd like for us in part 3 to shift into some questions and answers. And these are questions that I have gotten from clients over the years. And they're very common with people who grew up in environments where complex trauma was present. And the first question is, why do I panic after speaking up, even when nothing bad is happening? So again, think about this anticipatory threat. And if we look at it through the nervous system perspective, what we know is that our nervous system is wired to remember past relational consequences. So, for example, if speaking up once carried rejection or criticism or high levels of shame in your formative years, your body and your brain are really still anticipating the fallout, even sometimes when nothing bad is on the horizon. But our body remembers, right? So anxiety is scanning before this danger even pops up, if it does at all. And to go back and use more research from Brené Brown, she talks about this in the form of fitting in versus belonging. So if you've ever worked with younger children, specifically middle school age, we're all about the need to blend in. We are pack animals. It is survival. And the difference between fitting in and belonging is that our fitting in requires constant monitoring of how others perceive you. And so your body is always on alert. So that's why you can walk into a middle school cafeteria and just cringe with the awkwardness, because most all middle school children are experiencing that threat in their body of like, where do I sit? Where do I go? Where is my space? Whereas belonging, this shows up developmentally when we are a little bit further along and we have a stronger sense of self. Belonging allows you to show up fully without fear. And so your nervous system gets to relax, right? So that's why in high school and college, you start to see this shift in folks where they are starting to, again, understand their place and their sense of belonging. And they don't necessarily need to fit in all of these social groups because they've had a lot of practice. They've had years of establishing the sense of self. But if we're looking at it from a family of origin perspective, with complex PTSD and relational trauma, oftentimes we didn't feel like we belonged in our own families. There were conditions to our acceptance. We had to behave a certain way. We had to show up in a certain manner, because if we didn't, we would, quote, bring shame on the family. Some of us are from family systems where maybe that was even actually said. What are people going to think about us if you behave this way? And so what that teaches us is that, I've got to behave. I've got to do this monitoring thing to fit in. Because if not, there are consequences. Another question that I've gotten from a lot of clients is, why do I freeze in conflict and then hate myself afterwards for it? Oof, this is such a tough one and a common one. And my answer to that is, let's look at the freeze response. What is the freeze response? What's the purpose? And it's actually adaptive, again, because if fighting wasn't safe, then immobilization steps in to protect you. And later, the brain begins to layer on shame, like, I should have said something, which just fuels more anticipatory anxiety for next time. And from a CPTSD perspective, Let's go back to the nervous system, and this involves dorsal vagal activation. And remember that this is a nervous system pattern that leads to immobilization when threat feels unavoidable. So your body is trying to keep you safe, even if that leaves you feeling frustrated afterwards. And if you've listened to previous episodes where we went into the polyvagal theory, you'll remember that we talked about how animals have this beautiful ability to shake and move the trauma through their body after the threat is gone. But humans, we just have this tendency to internalize it and then assign it as something that was flawed and defective in us, when in reality, we were just trying to survive. Another question that I get from clients often is, how do I know if my anxiety is shame-based or if it's just regular old anxiety? And to this, I would answer this question with a question. So, can you ask yourself the next time you're feeling anxious, what am I afraid this says about me? And if your answer points to identity-based judgments like, I'm incompetent, I'm selfish, I'm rude, I'm unworthy, your anxiety is likely shame-driven. Whereas if you're having anxiety about something that's coming up, like a change, it could be, a move, or how's my life going to look differently? I can't picture this yet because I'm not there. That is more non-shame based because it's just the unknown, right? It's the fear of like, oh, I've not been here before. So that can be really helpful to distinguish shame-based identity from just regular old anxiety. If it is shame-based, think about the example of like sending a simple boundary text and how sometimes this might trigger a spike in your anxiety. And not because the boundary is wrong, but more because you imagine the other person judging you. So again, if you can create or identify the story or scenario in your head that you're making up, it's probably more rooted in shame than just uncertainty. Another question that I thought I would address is, okay, well, now that I know that this is shame-based anxiety, what do I do? So how do I stop anxiety from controlling me? And this is where Brené Brown's shame resilience framework can be very helpful. So first, we have to recognize the shame triggers. So she talks a lot about noticing the situations in your life that really activate that identity-based fear. So practicing with questions like, what will they think of me? And turning that into, what will I think of me? But first, again, we have to practice recognizing it. And then when we can do this, we can move into what she calls critical awareness. And this is a practice that questions the messages that your brain is repeating. So we're challenging the thoughts, the automatic thoughts. And then finally, if you can get your head and your heart around this practice, the third and probably most challenging step for us into interrupting this pattern is reaching out instead of isolating. Because remember, shame really thrives on secrecy, judgment, isolation. So when we can reach out to someone who is safe, someone who's earned that right in our life, the connection actually reduces the stronghold that shame has on us. And if you can combine this with practices like Kristin Neff's self-compassion work, speaking kindly to yourself, interrupting self-condemnation, softening your nervous system response, over time, this is going to rewire your brain to, again, move from a place of reaction to responsiveness. And my fifth and final question that I get a lot is, why does anxiety hit my body first? And I love when I get these questions again because I'm such a brain nerd. I get to dive in and really do the teaching part, which I love. So my answer to why anxiety hits the body first is, again, let's look at it through the CPTSD lens. It rewires the nervous system. So think about amygdala hyperactivation. CPTSD survivors, this has been proven by brain scans that we have a more sensitive amygdala response. So our alert to threat is probably a lot quicker than that of somebody that has not suffered from relational trauma. Same thing with prefrontal underregulation. And the prefrontal cortex, remember, is the CEO of the brain. It's the decision maker. It's the one that's involved in rationalizing, reasoning, helping us really organize our thoughts. But when you've had relational trauma from an early age, your prefrontal cortex is underregulated. It takes a lot more practice than that of the neurotypical brain. And then finally, our dorsal vagal freeze. This is, again, remember the shutdown or immobilization response in our nervous system, that when this gets activated, the shutdown, the immobilization just kicks right in there. So there's a practice of noticing when you're moving towards this shutdown or immobilization response, and then responding to this with things that feel grounding to you, with things that feel orienting to your surroundings, so that you do not go into that lengthy dissociation mode. So anxiety isn't just in your head, right? Anxiety shows up in your body first, and it is shaped by relational experiences and identity-based fears. And when you can understand this, it helps you respond with this awareness and compassion instead of this guilt and self-blame. I want to take a moment just to shift into culture and female socialization, because after all, this is a podcast for female survivors of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think it's important to point out that in our culture, women are often judged more harshly than men for these similar mistakes. So men are seen as assertive if they express their needs, where women are typically labeled more abrasive. Men are described as confident when they assert themselves, whereas women are described more often as intense or emotional. And when women speak up, when we make decisions, when we take risks, do you see now why this can trigger scrutiny that feels disproportionate? So if you carry relational trauma and you're navigating a culture that penalizes mistakes, of course your anxiety is going to compound, because the nervous system is already hyper alert and the external pressure reinforces these internal danger signals. So to that, I say constant self-monitoring isn't weakness in this context. It's this strategy that your mind and body developed for protection. It is adaptive. So given the double layers of relational trauma and societal expectations, when you recognize this, it can be a huge, powerful step towards shame resilience and self-compassion. Noticing the pattern without judging it and just gradually beginning to experience small acts of agency. But symptom management alone is not enough. So again, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, cognitive strategies, these are all so helpful in the moment. And I'm not discounting them by any means, but anxiety is always going to have a job to do if identity level shame remains unaddressed. So treating only the symptoms, it's like mopping up water while the faucet continues to run. So again, Brené's 3 components of shame resilience are really a roadmap for addressing this root. So I'll walk you through that one more time. Recognize the shame trigger. Notice situations that spark feelings of failure, not enoughness. And then practice that critical awareness. So question the internal messages. Are they facts? Or are they just maybe beliefs shaped by past trauma, cultural pressures? And then finally, reach out versus isolate. This is the most important component, I think, to the shame resiliency, because without connection with trusted people, it just keeps the shame's power going. And it really just reminds our nervous system that, oh, look, you're not safe. And just a little nuance for CPTSD here. These practices, again, they require so much repetition. Nervous system retraining requires patience and tenderness and the reminder that change does not happen overnight. And for us recovering perfectionists, that's a real sad message. But it's such a gradual recalibration of our mind and our body. I've talked before on this episode and previous episodes about Kristin Neff and just what a pioneer she's been for self-compassion, because she understands firsthand all about shame resiliency and how it directly reduces our anxiety. She talks a lot about speaking to somebody, or rather speaking to ourselves as someone that we love. So notice that inner critic, respond with kindness. And also, she does a lot of work now on a more global level, and she talks about interruption of global self-condemnation. So I invite you to catch statements like, I always mess this up, and replace them with a more balanced, compassionate truth. Because when shame softens through these practices, our anxiety begins to lose its job. And the body and the mind no longer need to overprotect us. And over time, our fear and our tension slowly begin to ease up. So I want to provide an example. Let's say you notice that your chest is tightening and you're having some racing thoughts before a social interaction. Instead of immediately reacting, can you recognize the shame trigger, which might sound something like, I'm afraid they'll judge me? Can you speak kindly to yourself? And can you maybe even reach out to someone supportive, either before or after the interaction? And what this does is over time, the anxious response begins to diminish and the anxiety is no longer running the show. Another way that you can look at this is recalling a recent anxiety spike. Ask yourself, what did I assume that this says about me? And secondly, is this true now? Or is this maybe more of a historical imprint? So in other words, is there a story from my formative years that drive this? So begin to notice your body, your chest, your shoulders, your jaw. And imagine giving your nervous system permission to relax slightly. not because danger isn't real, but because the threat is not present now. So as we wrap, I just want to review these takeaways that we looked at today. Number 1, shame targets identity, not behavior. Number 2, anxiety often protects us against relational exposure. Number 3, CPTSD amplifies hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, and internalized shame loops. And finally, shame resilience is all about recognition and awareness and connection. And this is the path to lasting anxiety relief. Your anxiety may not be weakness, it's loyalty, but you are allowed to belong without constant self-surveillance. I hope you will join me this week for a short midweek reflection on Wednesday, where we're going to look at where you may have chosen courage over fear. And if you're still new to this practice, you're going to want to tune in because we're going to be talking more about how to start choosing courage over fear. And this, again, creates healing and resiliency. So take care, everybody, and I'll see you back on Wednesday.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at CindyPayneRooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.